So thanks so much for being here once more, and I will go ahead and turn this over to Hester so that she can do her presentation, and then I will come back when we go ahead and do the Q&A. So Hester, it is all yours.
Okay. So welcome everyone, and thank you again for being here tonight. I'm coming to you from my house in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I'm back tonight with my Weimar-inspired costume. I've been trying to find another period-appropriate hat to cover up my quarantine hair, but so far no luck on that front. So I can't see any of you, unfortunately, but I know that there are, again tonight, some familiar faces out there, so greetings to everyone. I've also received great feedback on the series so far, so I really appreciate that so much, and I'm super pleased that people are finding such resonance with this event and this topic at the present time. So I'm going to begin tonight by offering some background on episodes 5 and 6 of Babylon Berlin, and we're going to look together at some images from the show and images from kind of Weimar culture and history more broadly. I've heard from some people that when I've been streaming clips, they don't come across well over Zoom, so I decided to skip the clips tonight, but I do have lots of images for you, I promise. And then after my conversation, we will open up, after my presentation, we will open up the conversation. You should be able to find buttons at the top or bottom of your screen that allow you to post questions through the Q&A function. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments as well as your questions about the series and episodes 5 and 6 in particular. As in previous weeks, I'm mostly going to try to avoid spoilers during my presentation and during the discussion, in advance of next week when we will be talking about the final 2 episodes of season 1 in our grand finale of this webinar series. And before I begin, I'd just like to express my thanks again to Raleigh Joyner of the Goethe-Institut in Washington, D.C. for all his work in organizing this series and also in moderating the discussion. So last week we talked a lot about the show's depiction of the events of the so-called Bloody May, when the Berlin police violently suppressed workers' demonstrations on May Day of 1929 in Berlin. These were significant events for German history, as I outlined last time, because they exacerbated political divisions between the Social Democrats who controlled the Berlin police at the time and the communists who had called for the May Day demonstrations despite bans on public protests in Berlin. And these conflicts, especially between the Social Democrats and the communists that were exacerbated by the May Day events, prevented the 2 parties from forming a unified front to combat the rise of Nazism. Obviously, these weren't the only events that prevented that unified front from developing, but they kind of exacerbated tensions that had already been there. Episodes 5 and 6 of Babylon Berlin continue to track the fallout of the Bloody May Day events, focusing especially on the efforts of prominent police and social democratic leaders to stage a cover-up, efforts in which Gerion Rath and Bruno Walter become involved. The police cover-up is juxtaposed with the outraged responses of working-class Berliners to the police violence, including the impassioned speech held by the communist Dr. Völker outside of police headquarters, a building that is referred to in the show and was known in the 1920s as the Rote Burg, or the Red Fortress. And by the way, since that building was eventually torn down, it no longer exists. Babylon Berlin uses the facade of the Rotes Rathaus, or the Berlin City Hall, which is nearby to the location of the original Rote Burg, next to Alexanderplatz. So the sequences that are taken on location at the police headquarters are actually shot at the Rotes Rathaus. I want to focus for a moment on how exactly the show uses audiovisual means to figure political divisions in Weimar Berlin, and I'm going to enable the share screen here quickly, so bear with me while I pull up my slides. Here we go. I think this looks like it's working, but Raleigh, I trust that if it's not working, you will tell me. So
I see it.
Okay, great. So we first see the communist demonstration at street level, through an over-the-shoulder shot that essentially captures Dr. Fulker's point of view as she speaks to the workers. And subsequently, this street-level view is cross-cut with scenes that take place inside police headquarters that frame the perspective of various characters there as they look down on the demonstration from above. For instance, this shot, which is taken from Bruno Wolter's perspective, he peeks through the slats of the window blinds at the crowd down below. And another example is here, where we see Police President Karl Zurgiebel in a similar shot, framed through the windows, the crowd below framed through the windows as he looks down upon them. Shots like these in Babylon Berlin use editing and cinematography to map power relations spatially, engaging in a familiar trope of Weimar cinema that is perhaps most famously used in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, as we see here, with the mogul here on the left side of the screen, Jo Fredersen in his office high above the city, and the workers' colony deep down below. And of course, this is now a standard cinematic technique for visualizing power, but Metropolis offers an especially salient early example of this that is kind of taken up again in Babylon Berlin. And the use of sound is also interesting in these sequences as the workers' chants and Fulker's speech penetrate inside the spaces of the Red Fortress, appearing to spur on the police conversation about the cover-up that they will engage in, and raising questions that circulate throughout these episodes and the entire series about mobility and confinement. Questions like which bodies are allowed to move in and through which spaces, and who is trapped and who can escape. And I think those questions will become increasingly significant as the show moves on through the end of season 1 and through the next season. So Rat, our protagonist, generally moves seamlessly through various milieux. But in these 2 episodes that we're discussing tonight, we witness him twice being ejected from working class spaces when he's identified as a police officer. The first time is in the subway car that he enters when he's chasing after Krajewski, and the second when he returns to the apartment that was the site of the police murder of the 2 civilian women that he and Bruno had witnessed. And Rat, if you recall, uses the opportunity at the wake that's being held for the 2 women to kind of sneak back into the apartment and do some sleuthing of the bullet holes on their balcony because he's been asked to help fudge the report in the police cover-up. And in both of these cases, in the subway car and at the wake, Rat is ejected from the space as voices cry, murderer, murderer, kind of underscoring the escalating political divisions of the time. So it's in response to this accusation that the police are murderers that they adopt what is really a well-worn tactic of political subterfuge by insisting that their opponents fired the first shot. That's obviously false. And they take advantage of the fact that, as we witness in the opening scene of episode 5, a careless police officer has allowed his very young son to get a hold of his service weapon and shoot him with it. And it's this man who is later trotted out as a police hero, masquerading as the first casualty of the May Day conflict in order to lay the blame squarely on the side of the communists. And here we see Benda, who's the head of the political police, who from here on out takes on an increasingly important role in the series. And Benda is the one who first proposes this cover-up. And as a little aside, it's quite interesting, a good example of the show's sly casting choices, that Benda is played by the actor Matthias Brandt, who is the youngest son of West German politician Willy Brandt, who was the first social democratic chancellor of the post-war Federal Republic, and who also notably won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1971 for his significant role in reconciling political divisions between Western and Eastern Europe during the Cold War period. So this casting of Benda as the kind of figure behind the cover-up here is quite an interesting casting choice. So as we discussed last time, the political divisions that are the subject of, in many ways, the subject of the show, Babylon Berlin, date back to the origins of the Weimar Republic in the wake of World War I. And these two episodes, again, take up the topic of the Great War and its impact. For instance, we encounter once more Dr. Anno Schmidt, the head of the Institute for Suggestive Therapy, who, at the behest of the Armenian, twice repairs Kardakov after he is injured. And episode 6 ends with a noteworthy and mysterious scene that takes place at the Institute, where a large group of war veterans gather in this kind of great hall. And here we see a striking shot of a man with a facial prosthesis. It's a metaphorical image for the broader attention to some of the questions we've been talking about regarding performance, masquerade, and doubling in the show. But also it's a reminder of how prosthetics inspired Weimar culture and world culture during this period. And I just put together a couple of images that kind of give a sense of this centrality of the figure of the human machine assemblage in Weimar culture. We have here a painting by Otto Dix called Prague Street from 1920. And in that picture, you can see kind of a range of prostheses of various kinds configured in the background, as well as the man on wheels in the foreground. The second image is Otto Umber's collage called Der Rasende Reporter, the racing reporter, which is an image of the journalist known as the racing reporter Egon Erwin Kisch from 1926, and then a poster from Metropolis with the famous machine-human assemblage, the robot Maria. In episode 6, Wolter and Rath also track down the war veteran and former policeman Krajewski to a drug den where he and other traumatized war veterans are living in squalor. To force Krajewski to divulge crucial information about the Adenauer blackmail case that he continues to pursue, Rath and Wolter then confine Krajewski in a prison cell and withhold the drugs that he needs. In an aptly creepy sequence, Wolter intimidates both Krajewski and Rath by demonstrating his awareness of what Rath secretly shares in common with Krajewski, and that is dependence on drugs as a remedy for shell shock. Wolter dismisses both men, Krajewski and Rath, as Flattermänner, a derogatory term for those whose PTSD manifested itself in uncontrollable trembling. And in this shot, which is obviously inspired by expressionist cinematography, Rath and Wolter walk through a sinister back alley as Rath defends himself, noting that there are still some kaputte Automaten, broken automatons, to use another one of Wolter's pejorative terms, who can think and act for themselves. And to prove this point, he punches his colleague in the face. Wolter's disdain for traumatized war veterans more broadly definitely reveals him as a slippery character, coming back to something we talked a little bit about at the end of last time, and someone to watch out for, a point that is underscored by the associations called forth by these cinematic shadows. And these are just a couple of images, notorious images of shadows from Weimar cinema and later. So the first kind of bluish looking image from the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, then the brownish tinged image from Nosferatu, M in the bottom left corner, which we know was a significant influence on Volker Kutscher, who wrote the novels upon which Babylon Berlin are based. And then at the bottom right, the first post-war German film from 1946, The Murderers Are Among Us, which kind of was the first to pick up again on this Weimar imagery of shadows. While the shadows are an allusion to Weimar cinema, These two episodes are again also rife with direct citations of Weimar films. For instance, in the scene when Rath visits the Geyer Works, which was an actual post-production facility that processed and copied films for the industry in the Weimar period and also later. And it is here at the Geyer Works that Rath stumbles in on Karl Mayr and Josef von Sternberg watching Marlene Dietrich's screen test for the Blue Angel. And this is actually the real footage of those screen tests. And I'm going to return to this question of citations and delusions in a moment, but I want to stick for a moment with Marlene Dietrich, who is, of course, one of the most famous figures to emerge worldwide from Weimar Berlin after her breakout role as the cabaret performer Lola Lola in The Blue Angel from 1930. Herself bisexual, Dietrich was a regular in the queer nightlife of the era, appearing at clubs like the one that Lotte and Rath visit at the end of episode 5. The club that they go to is called Der Holländer. And I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that Berlin was really the epicenter of LGBTQ life in Europe during the 1920s, with a significant queer population, a very active gay publishing scene, which you can see examples of here, and more than 100 gay and lesbian bars. And this historic transvestite club called the El Dorado in the Gayborhood, as they call it, of Berlin-Schöneberg, may have served as one inspiration for the club that Lotte and Rath visit, Der Holländer. As we can see here, this is an image from inside the El Dorado in the 20s. And I think there's just some resonance here to the portrayal of the performer Tretchkov, and here Graef, the police photographer who appears, whom Rath encounters in drag at the Holländer Club. So Berlin was not only the site of an important queer scene in the interwar period, but also the center of scholarly research on sexuality pioneered particularly by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld at the Institute for Sexual Science, founded in Berlin in 1919. Sometimes Hirschfeld was referred to as the inventor of homosexuality, and he argued that human sexuality is expressed in a diversity of ways that should not be subject to either legislation or moral censure. Understanding homosexuality as innate, he was an important activist for decriminalization, and he founded the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäre Komitee, or the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which was the first organization worldwide to advocate for LGBTQ rights. Hirschfeld also conceptualized gender as non-binary, comprising a spectrum of possible identifications. He helped popularize the notion of sexual intermediaries, what we might today think of as gender fluidity, and sometimes what was known at the time as the third sex. He also coined the term transvestite to describe people who might today understand themselves as transgender. And although, well, his work kind of humorously, you see a picture here of the archive at the Institute for Sexual Science that shows this kind of mania for classification, and this was maybe common to the period. One of Hirschfeld's writings suggests that there are 43,046,721 possible gender expressions across humankind. So there's this kind of mania for classification, but his work really played a central role in transforming ideas about gender and sexuality in the modern era. And not surprisingly, one of the key ways that he did this, that he set about doing this, was through the popular new medium of film. For instance, he served as a consultant on Richard Oswald's 1919 film Anders als die anderen, or Different from the Others, and you can see a poster and a still from the film here. This is one of the very first feature films ever to be made about homosexuality, a so-called Aufklärungsfilm, or educational film that sought to educate the audience about the perils of sexual taboos while also advocating for the abolition of paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, which criminalized homosexuality. Hirschfeld himself appeared in the film together with the star Conrad Veidt, and you can see some images here of Hirschfeld together with Veidt in the film. Different from the others, was released in the same year as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, also starring Conrad Veidt. And in her book, The Queer German Cinema, the scholar Alice Kuzniar has drawn a connection between these two characters portrayed by the same actor in the same year. She writes, Cesare, the character from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, seems to belong to a third category that holds other binaries in suspension. What cannot be seen or determined is the allegory of his androgyny, arousing an indefinable anxiety and curiosity, yet also desire. He is a figure on which to project spectatorial ambivalence about homosexuality, end of quote. And indeed, as Kuzniar points out, the presence of the gender invert, as the third sex character was often called at the time, can be detected among the most luminous creations of the Weimar screen. And I really think that Babylon Berlin here, and then in some episodes that are coming up, kind of picks up on and reflects on this presence in Weimar cinema. And here is a scene different from the others, which is the drag ball sequence of the film. And drag balls were a popular feature of the nightlife of Weimar Berlin. And you can see this is a slightly different image of that drag ball in the 1919 film. And again, there's this kind of interesting resonance in the scene in Der Holländer that we can find there. So the scene in Der Holländer offers a vivid depiction of both the transgression of sexual and gender norms and taboos that was possible in Weimar Berlin, and also the pervasive sense of foreboding and precariousness that nonetheless attached to the queer scene. And I think we get this especially in the interrogation of Tretchkov and the divulgence of the location of the Trotskyite factions headquarters. This double-edged quality, this kind of emancipatory trajectory, and then this simultaneous foreboding or precariousness is also evident in the final sequence that I want to touch on today before we open things up for conversation. And this is the one that takes place at the rowing club in episode 6. So last time I talked about this scene in episode 3, when Lotte goes to the movies and watches the film Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday from 1930. And here the film returns again, as portions of it are remade virtually shot for shot in Babylon Berlin. And I have a couple of slides here just to give you a sense of what this remake looks like. Oops, you'll see that the visual resemblance is really striking. And I didn't have enough time to really isolate the screenshots down to the most perfect matches, although I think you really could do that, but I think I got it well enough that you can get a sense of some of the overlap in how these scenes look. And so the visual resemblance between the two films, or between People on Sunday and Babylon Berlin, is quite striking, but so are the themes and the affects evoked in these sequences, including the depiction of class conflict and gender relations, as well as the encroaching feeling of doom amidst the sort of lightness of the sequence. For instance, when Fritz and Otto, these two characters, appear, when they first appear, they mention Lenin and Hitler, and they're talking about political violence. And this is the only mention, I believe, of Hitler that we hear in season 1 of Babylon Berlin. And later, as you see here, they kind of creep up on Greta as she's reading on the dock, and then they kidnap her in a scene that's both sort of light and jocular, but also a bit scary and foreboding. So I find Babylon Berlin's invocation of People on Sunday, and I keep returning to it during these presentations, I find it noteworthy for 2 reasons that I want to mention briefly. The first is that when we think of interwar Germany today, we often think of German expressionism, which has left obviously a lasting imprint on global film history and on the arts more broadly. And while expressionism does show up in Babylon Berlin, for instance, in the shots that I discussed earlier of Rath's and Wolter's looming shadows, in fact, the show engages much more deeply, I would say, with the style and artifacts associated with the cultural movement known as Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity. So mention am Sonntag is paradigmatic among these artifacts and references, but we also see the influence of a couple of other cinematic landmarks in the show. For instance, Berlin, die Symphonie der Großstadt, a film I mentioned before, the 1927 film made by Walter Ruttmann, and you see a couple of images here from that film, including one in the bottom right corner that takes place at Café Josti, which is also a primary setting of Babylon Berlin. And I also wanted to mention, in terms of film and new objectivity, Kule Wampe, which is the 1932 film directed by Zlatan Dudow and co-written by Bertolt Brecht. And there are other examples as well, but I think these are three that figure into the audiovisual language of Babylon Berlin specifically. So new objectivity emerged in the late 1920s as kind of a response to or a way out of expressionism, emphasizing a realist style, so that's the objectivity piece, documentary elements, and a focus on the visible world, as opposed to the manifestation of subjective internal vision pursued by expressionism. And in film, specifically, new objectivity often involved authentic locations, lay actors, and a hybrid form that mixed documentary footage with a loose story, often breaking conventions of narrative and genre. In this way, the exemplary films of the new objectivity, and perhaps People on Sunday most specifically, anticipate characteristics of what is sometimes referred to as contemporary post-cinema, with its open-ended defiance of convention and blurring of affects. As I suggested last time, Babylon Berlin, itself a film epic made expressly for the small screen, and thus a part of post-cinematic media culture, telescopes us backward through film history, envisaging Weimar through the lens of Hollywood noir films. And I think new objectivity functions as a kind of fulcrum for this reversal. So this is one of the reasons that I find it very interesting to think about the role of People on Sunday in particular for Babylon Berlin. And the second reason I'm interested in Babylon Berlin's citation of People on Sunday also connects to the show's status relative to contemporary cinema and media. As film scholars do not tire of noting, contemporary film, especially but not exclusively film from global Hollywood, is a cinema of remakes, reboots, sequels, and adaptations. From the Marvel Cinematic Universe to the Star Wars franchise, from Lord of the Rings to Harry Potter, all of contemporary cinema, it seems, is derivative of something else that came before. And Babylon Berlin is, of course, also an adaptation of the Volker Kutscher novels, which themselves seem to perform a kind of clever cultural remix, as we've seen, of elements taken from prestige serials like The Sopranos, kind of jumbled up with aspects of Weimar cinema and authentic settings straight out of post-unification Berlin tourism. Yet, Babylon Berlin, whether we want to think of it as a remake, a reboot, or a remix, deploys citation in interesting ways that I think merit further discussion. In part, this has to do with the show's approach to history, which I've talked about previously as this kind of refusal to fetishize the past, something that kind of unsettles both our comprehension of the Weimar period and our understanding of our present time, and makes us think about the relationships between these two eras, the 1920s and now. For me, it also has to do with the show's really complex formal composition, a kind of collage aesthetic that I would like to think about more as a critical mode of assembling images from found materials. And I wanted to end today with another very famous visual artifact from the Weimar period, that is Hannah Höchst's 1919 collage called Cut with a Dada Kitchen Knife. No, I forget the exact title and my screen is in the way. Through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch in Germany. So I think this collage of Hannah Höch is a kind of an interesting counterpoint, maybe way of thinking about the idea of the collage performed by Babylon Berlin in a very different moment with a very different form of media at stake, and also obviously a very different kind of production model. So I'm not exactly comparing the two things, but I think questioning the extent to which we might think about assembling and reassembling images as a critical practice is a question that is open for me about Babylon Berlin, and I'd like to think about it some more. And this just brings me to close to one of the viewing questions I posed this week, and that is, why do you think it was so important for the creators of Babylon Berlin to make these cultural references so integral to the composition of the show? So I will stop here and open it up for conversation about this or any other topics that you would like to talk about.
Hester, are you able to enable my video?
Let's see.
Actually, you know what? Oh wait, I think I can do it.
Okay, I don't see how to do that. There we go.
I clicked reclaim host, and then this big thing came up. It was like, you are the host now. Anyway, so thanks so much to Dr. Baer for that presentation. And just as we're transitioning over to the Q&A, since I know a few people may be curious about what people have responded to where they're from, I was very interested too. We have some folks from, of course, the DC, Alexandria, Northern Virginia, Maryland area, but we also have someone tuning in from Miami, which you're lucky. That sounds nice. Northampton, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Austin, Texas, among some other places. So thanks to you all who have said where you're from, and if you would still like to mention that, feel free to. So I'm going to go into the first comment, which is from UN. And this is actually commenting on Nüssen and the family, sort of in episode 6, when they have this sort of hunt, and they're talking about sort of bringing back it's a kind of very cloaked dialogue that they have. But UN says, I enjoyed the symbolism of the younger and more skilled and strategically positioned Wendt, the guy with the big scar on his face, snatching a kill out of the hands of Zegers, with Wendt, who has a literal higher hand, representing the Nazis, Zegers, the imperial revanchists, and the deer, the fragility of the current democratic republic. So that's how UN has interpreted it. If any of you or anybody watching just might need a refresher, that's the scene where they're all sort of in Tracht, in very traditional German hunting clothes. And the older guy, who was a World War I veteran, he's aiming at a deer, and he decides it's too far away, and then the other guy shoots, kills it. So Hester, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great point. It's definitely a very symbolic scene that's done almost for high camp, I would say. That's that particular scene. And I really do enjoy how these actors, Benno Furman, who plays Wendt, and also Lars Eidinger, who plays Alfred Nüssen, I appreciate how much they relish these roles, and you can really see this with this scene in particular. He's really hamming it up in this scene, and I think you get it right. I mean, it's very foreboding at the same time. In terms of this creepy military operation, Operation Prangertag, that has been arranged. They have the hunting expedition, which, as you say, is very symbolic. That is building up to this huge military exercise that's going to take place on the estate, and which is referred to as the hope for Germany, this military exercise. So yes, this small scene with the deer is kind of a nutshell version of the larger military exercise that's taking place. So I think you hit the nail on the head there, Ewan.
Yeah, and I was wondering also, could you say just a little more about this particular group of people, like these Kaisertreu, as I sort of understood them to be, or people who sort of want to bring back the empire. There's that sort of different group of people. So, you've got, so far in Babylon, Berlin, you've got the communists, and you've got, the people who are, who would ultimately be the ones who accommodate Nazism into this society. Right now, this is supposed to be a democracy, but then you've got this group of people who are interested in bringing back Germany as an empire, as something with a king, not a king, a Kaiser. So, is there a little more you could say about that particular movement at the time?
Well, I think the show really emphasizes this military industrial complex, more so than it does really the interest in bringing back an aristocracy or bringing back an empire. Certainly it's about the remilitarization of Germany and the reestablishment of military power, but I think the interesting part of this storyline, and also the train becomes a real crux, a symbolic crux of this. I think the interesting thing here is the cooperation between the military elite, the industrialist family represented by the Nussens, and the proto-fascists, the Nazis, who aren't really showing their cards so much at this time, any of them. And like I said, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, because I know that there are some people who are watching this along with the webinar series, so I don't want to go too deep into that, but keep your eyes on that. I think the train is quite interesting here because it's got the gas, it's got the money, and the different factions are fighting over it. So and want it for different reasons, right? But it sort of, as an emblem in the show, it really symbolizes this military industrial complex that lies at the crux of what the Nazis then successfully are able to, the different groups that the Nazis are successfully able to bring together eventually, right?
Right, and we definitely should get back to the mechanization of the world and the symbol of the train. In the meantime, we have had some other thoughts on that same scene with the deer. Jill Smith has said Wendt is not a Nazi, that he's just another more modern version of a right-wing nationalist.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then Michelle M. said, I was fascinated with this scene, which oozes critique of toxic masculinity. And this could also be said for the fight between Rat and Walter. Both could be said to be vulnerability in men vulnerability in men prompts fighting or war or violence. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the show is, I mean, yeah, you said it. I don't know what else I can add, but the show is engaging with this idea of fragile and toxic masculinity again and again. And this is something that crosses all of the classes and all of the political groups, absolutely.
And I thought it was also amusing. I mean, there are little bits of comedy in the show that sort of feel not necessarily out of place, but they feel like, oh yeah, there are moments that are funny. And of course, I think that the slapping match between those two was one of those kinds of moments, but also, I mean, I couldn't help but think about the fact that Rat is significantly younger than Walter. So, and that they're both also at the same time veterans of the same war, which you don't often see a generation difference like that, where both men in that same generation, or both men were veterans of that same war, although they're totally different generations. So I sort of perceived also a little bit of a generation struggle there, sort of like manifested in, slapping, but which of course is also very interesting because, when you think of people slapping, you don't really think of men doing that to each other. You usually think of fisticuffs, not, and then doing it back to the other person. That's more something that is historically thought of as the way women fight. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing too. Let's see. So Jill has also mentioned more of a comment than a question. So Hester, I agree with you about the importance of Neue Sachlichkeit for the series. An element that underscores the lighthearted side of episode 6's scenes at the rowing club is also a gender reversal of People on Sunday. Lotte is there on Stefan Jeneka's invitation, just like Christel is invited by Wolfgang. And yet Lotte winds up flirting more with Rudi, who's the much less restrained, he's the one who was naked, working class medical student, similar to the way that Wolfgang switches his affections to Brigitte. So these different girls that are sort of more upper class who are hanging out on the lake. So what do you make of this gender switch of the People on Sunday storyline? And what do you make of the class dynamics that are exposed in this scene by the snobby girls at the rowing club, the ones who make fun of Lotte's bathing suit, and asking Stephen why he brought all the poles to the club? Is there any thoughts you have about how that scene highlights class?
Yes, thank you. And let me just reiterate, I really appreciate the comments and corrections and also questions from all the people in the audience. I'm seeing this streaming panel on my screen of all the people here who very prominent scholars of German studies, Weimar cinema and culture, who definitely often know more about this topic than I do, so bring it on. I just love seeing all the comments here. It's great. So this is Jill Smith again, professor at Bowdoin College and author of the excellent book Berlin Coquette. I highly recommend it. I do think that this gender switch that you point out, that is the character Lotte, occupies a role that in the original film, People on Sunday, was maybe occupied by one of the male characters. I do think this is a great example of the way that the show sort of retrospectively manipulates some of the original source material that it's citing in order to think through the dynamics of gender and sexuality from a more contemporary perspective. And I mean, this is not to say that that perspective wasn't there in the Weimar period, because as I've mentioned before, I think Lotte's characterization is really based on, in many ways, on the novels of Irmgard Coin, especially the artificial silk girl and the character Doris, and the protagonist of that book, but also somewhat Gilgi from the novel Gilgi, One of Us. So I think that if you thought about sticking one of Coin's characters into the film Menschen am Sonntag, you would get something like how Lotte is portrayed in this scene, kind of switching her affections from Jeneke, for whom she never really has too many affections to begin with, as we also know from the Mocha FD dance scene previously, over to the medical student. But Lotte is a real opportunist when it comes to her relationships with men, and she's figured out that she can use Rudi to dissect the corpse that she wants to get clues from. So I think that's also a part of what's going on here. And yes, the class dynamics, I think, are quite interesting in this scene. The snobby girls who are criticizing Jeneke for bringing trolls to the lake and to make fun of the bathing costumes of Goethe and Lotte and so forth. And I think this is one place where the show introduces a little bit more of a critical lens on class relations in the Weimar period. Different from the nightlife, where it seems to suggest people are able to mix without conflict. And it's a way of building on the themes of these two episodes, which involve political divisions, I think, really strongly. But I think it's also important for foreshadowing some things that are happening with the characters of Fritz and Otto and Greta, who first encounter one another at the lake here.
So on sort of the topic of Menschen am Sonntag and this sort of parallels between those scenes and that film, Sherwood has submitted the comment. Well, he says that, Hester, he's been reading your essay on the Berlin School, so you might want to say a little bit about what that movement of film is. And he says, I've been trying to figure out how you got from the Berlin School, this avant-garde that resists Hollywood studio conventions, to Babylon Berlin, which is sort of the ultimate example of a Hollywood or Netflix aesthetic. And when you were talking about people on Sunday, it sounded as if you considered Babylon Berlin an example of post-cinema comparable to Thomas Arslan. And would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts?
Wow, okay, I love that question. Thank you very much for that. The Berlin School is, for those of you unfamiliar with that moniker, kind of loosely affiliated group of contemporary filmmakers, let's say since the turn of the new millennium, who make rather austere films that really break with Hollywood convention, long takes, slow unfolding of plot lines, and so forth. I don't think that Babylon Berlin is at all doing the same thing as the Berlin School films. However, I'm quite interested in the way that we might think about a film like People on Sunday as a common point of orientation for counter-cinematic filmmakers of the German tradition, and Babylon Berlin, obviously a very popular entertainment piece. So I don't think they're at all the same, but I do think that they're emerging from similar preoccupations in a similar historical moment, and that they draw on similar points of orientation, and it's those connections that are very interesting to me. Excuse me. And post-cinema is a complicated category, I think, sort of problematic and under theorized or meaning different things to different people. And I'm using it very loosely in this context, I will admit. But I do think that post-cinema designates something about a moment when film is no longer a dominant cultural category. And that might be because it's been eclipsed by digital media and streaming platforms and different modes of production and dissemination, as opposed to how we classically think of cinema as something that takes place in a movie theater for a collective audience viewing something simultaneously together in a time-based way, things like that. So post-cinema, I think, although it's a loose term, can capture something about what streaming Netflix German shows are doing, and what counter-cinematic filmmakers who are trying to do something different with film itself at a moment when it's no longer the dominant medium, albeit in very different kinds of ways when we're talking about economics, formal aesthetic qualities, and politics and other categories. It can capture maybe something about what connects these different things. And how did I get from the Berlin School to Babylon Berlin? I am not writing in my own research about Babylon Berlin. As I've said in the previous incarnations of this event, I'm a fan of the show. I'm really fascinated by it, especially by its sort of aesthetics and its style, and I kind of have compulsively consumed it again and again. And so I'm kind of doing this as from a standpoint of fandom a little bit more than from a standpoint of really learned, careful research and engagement with the show. But I also do teach about it, and I generally think about German cinema and media in broad terms. So it's definitely a show that falls within the realm of the things that I'm quite interested in.
And one thing that, just the mention of the Berlin School, I mean, I'm not an expert at all in the Berlin School, but the films that I have seen have similar qualities that, I mean, generally Berlin School films present characters that you really aren't supposed to like. They're very ambiguous or ambivalent in terms of like, am I supposed to really be, versus like a very traditional film where it's like, oh, I'm on board with this person, I'm rooting for a certain person. Everybody in a Berlin School film seems to be much more realistically flawed in a way that you're not really rooting for anybody in particular, and sometimes you actually dislike everybody in some cases. But I would say that it seems to sort of have a bit of an echo in the Neue Sachlichkeit approach, where it's like, okay, we're moving away from people who have these dramatic movements, you know, and people who have such dramatic faces, like Conrad Veidt, who has this, you know, insanely expressive face, which I think is why he was so popular at the time. And then, you know, moving into just laymen, like you said, actors who don't have anything remarkable about them. And I sort of see that also in the Berlin School. I don't know, that just happened to be a parallel that popped up in my brain as we were talking.
Yeah, absolutely. It's authentic shooting locations, very sort of style of cinematography and lighting and so forth that's very non-studio, that's very, you know, verges on sort of a documentary style, and the use of oftentimes lay actors. These are all aspects of Berlin School filmmaking that are reminiscent of the new objectivity aesthetic.
And we have a couple of questions that sort of linger on the idea of aesthetics. So on that, Jill also says that in one of your comments, you mentioned camp aesthetics, and she would like to hear more about what you think and examples of the camp aesthetic in Babylon Berlin.
Okay, well, I think that's a big topic, and maybe I haven't thought it through carefully, because I think it's tricky to think about how things like irony or camp work in sort of the current moment of whether we want to call it post cinema or not, and I think the show, in so far as it jumbles a lot of different styles and signifiers up together, is complicated to really think through how that might work. But I do think, for instance, that scene, I think I said that it was pretty campy, the scene where the shooting scene where the men are shooting the deer, and I think that scene it's kind of a reboot of something from a Heimat film from the 1950s, almost in its style, and they're sort of, the actors are all sort of hyper aware of what they're doing and how hilarious it is, and so it really registers, especially in the performance of Benno Fürmann. But let me think about that question. I think it's a really quite interesting question to think about. Also in terms of how Babylon Berlin is or isn't engaging with a sort of history of queer cinema in the German context, or queer aesthetics more broadly, which I tried to sort of just open up as a topic a little bit in the presentation tonight, but which is certainly not the first or last word on that topic. And I would be really interested in what some of the other people here think about the show's representation of and use of those sort of signifiers and cultural citations.
And I was also, just to jump on that, I mean, Sophie submitted an interesting comment that made me think of the sort of correlation that I've seen in this episode, in episode 6, especially the correlations between sort of camp and class. Because I also found that to be a little bit campy when they're doing the rowing race. And it's not just me, I realize, who thinks that looks a little bit silly, because then they cut to the public beach where all of the working class people have to swim at the Wannsee, and they're watching it and they're thinking, really? You know, like, and, you know, and then as she points out, she says that whole sequence at the Newson family estate reminded me strongly of Gosford Park, set over the course of a hunting weekend around the same time at one of the last big old-fashioned aristocratic estates in England. Obviously, there's less room for the light wit of a drawing room comedy or Christie-style murder mystery in Babylon, Berlin, but I felt that there was a wink towards contemporary viewers who would find the Newsons and their milieu kind of pathetically out of touch. And I thought that was an interesting comment because it does, I would say that the swimming scene and the hunting scene, they're in such great contrast to the other kinds of settings and the other kinds of spaces that we see in Babylon, Berlin. And also the way they're dressed. You have all these other people who are dressed in sort of the clothing of the time, and then you got these guys walking around in their old military uniforms or in traditional hunting gear. And it does give you this idea where you're like, where do you go? And they're in a castle in like, you know, the outskirts, probably in Brandenburg somewhere, you know, like, what do you guys think is happening right now? It just, yeah, out of touch is a very good way to put it, I think.
Yeah, and this brings us back to just the way that the show depicts inequality, you know, and precarity as key topics that resonate between the past and present. And I think your point that it's kind of reminiscent of the kind of heritage style that is represented by something like Gosford Park, but then is a bit also critical of that way of fetishizing a prior period of opulence that is permanently lost now. I mean, the show inserts those sequences in part in order to comment, you know, precisely on those differences. And the shot that you pointed out from the lake sequence, where you see the beach where the masses have to swim, and the contrast between that and the area where the fraternity has its rowing club, is another good example of that, this kind of zooming in and out that happens in the show. And I mean, it brings me back to this point that I've made a couple of times before about the way that the show doesn't romanticize the Weimar period, and the way that it really portrays the kind of messiness of the period. And this is one of the reasons that I think it's really more interesting than it could be as a, you know, the most expensive German serial television show of all time. I think it really does do something interesting in its depiction of this history that I've been kind of trying to put my finger on in different ways.
So just Linda R. has also posed a question that I would say also sort of goes into the idea of aesthetics and cinematography, sort of the technicalities of film. She says there are a couple of cuts to an extreme high angle shot. She points out Hitchcock uses these to mark moments of crisis. Do you think these shots serve any particular purpose in the series? You mentioned certain shots where people are looking down, you know, to literally portray class and social differences. Do you have any other thoughts on camera angles and how they might convey meaning?
I'm not sure if I can think off the top of my head of exactly which shots that Linda has in mind, though I would like to know, because I appreciate that attention to the details of the compositions of the shots and the cinematography. I think the show in general is very deliberate with its use of cinematography, and you know, I tried to talk about that just a little bit in terms of this kind of mapping of space. There's numerous interesting shots that I haven't been able to capture or talk about. One that really stands out to me is in one of the earlier episodes, maybe 3 or 4, I can't exactly remember right now. There's a shot of, it's when Rat goes to visit Mutti, the character in Wedding, who is a sex worker who might hold a clue to the painting in the Adenauer blackmail photo. And in that scene, there's this very interesting high-angle shot down onto the courtyard, the Hinterhof of the building where she lives, and we've seen a butcher slaughtering meat back there, and this shot it just kind of stands out for its composition and for the way, again, that it demonstrates something about the space of the city and the inequality that the space of the city figures for the characters who are confined to living in these very dark back areas, and this butchered character. And these types of shots are very reminiscent, again, of images from Weimar films, especially the type of sort of Kammerspiel film, or the domestic melodramas that took place often in these Hinterhofe films, like Hintertreppe, for example, or Backstairs. So I think oftentimes these are kind of citational shots, and shots that are demonstrating something about the space of the city that's integral to this kind of mapping of inequality. But thank you for noticing that.
And also on that, it reminded me of, I wish I remember who wrote about this specific topic, but the way that the city of Berlin sort of developed with the Mietskaserne, or the tenements, where they were sort of, I mean, the way I sort of think of them is like honeycombs or waffles, you know, where you've got the front house facing the street, and that's kind of the ideal way to live at this time, because you have windows that can open onto the street, you get fresh air. And the further back, if many people tuning in, if you might be familiar with the way the old buildings, apartment buildings in Berlin are, or in Germany in general, you know, you go through one courtyard and then you have the Hinterhof, and then you can keep having more and more Hinterhofe. And generally the idea is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but generally the idea is that the further back you live, the poorer you are, and also the worse you have it, because your little courtyard that you look out into is usually stinkier, it's darker. People just throw their trash and their sewage out into the courtyard. If you all remember the part where Kardakov dies for like the third time and falls into this disgusting pool of whatever that is, in the middle of, once again, a courtyard, although that was more of a wealthy apartment building that he was in. But the idea, yeah, of the courtyard sort of being where all of the dreck just collects of all of the people living in the surrounding apartments, you know. And I think, yeah, I've noticed quite a few of these courtyard shots from.
And that might have been another one of the shots that Linda was referring to. That's a great shot. Yeah, I wasn't thinking about that, but that's a great shot, and it's quite interesting because, well, Kardakov doesn't die because he's got, I don't know, the little red book of someone in his breast pocket.
Yeah, no, and he's like a cat, yeah.
But what's interesting there is that several people look for him, but who finds him? Lotte, because she knows the back courtyards, and so she also lives in a tenement house of that nature, so she looks down and notices that something is maybe not looking quite right down there, and so she actually goes into that murky slime and checks it out. So yeah, the figures out that something was going on there. So that's also an interesting aspect of that. But that was a great shot, the shot of Kardakov floating in the muck in the back courtyard.
So also on the topic just of space, Amanda has asked the question. So she says, I'm struck by the emphasis on temporality through space to reflect time. As you point out in your questions, subway platforms and bridges mark symbolic spaces in these two episodes. Is this about the relationship between characters in these spaces, or more about the Weimar period itself? And how can we reflect on the architecture of the bridge as also being red brick, or the maze that is the platform with the stairs?
Great question. I'm just trying to recall the maze that is the platform with the stairs. That's maybe at the subway platform at Friedrichstrasse, where
I think so, yeah.
Lotte and Rat meet up to go to the Holländer, perhaps.
I think so.
Yeah, and we also see the Oberbaumbrücke, the bridge that links Kreuzberg to Friedrichshain across the Spree, and it's the big red brick bridge. Yeah, I mean, I think, and we've seen, you know, I talked about the sort of symbolism of the train. We talked about trains and platforms. We haven't talked so much about bridges. I mean, I think there's one way in which these, again, are just the establishing shots of Berlin that are familiar to contemporary tourists and are therefore pleasing for the global audience of the show, people who might have visited Berlin before, and to experience a resonance between this kind of depiction of Weimar Berlin and images that are familiar from the present. And that's one of the main tricks that the show uses to appeal to a wide audience. But I think that your question also emphasizes the tropes that the show picks up on from Weimar cinema. Again, this kind of the spiral staircases and the doublings and the spatial areas that double back on themselves, or we can think of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and its very skewed depiction of space. Spatial representation as a marker not only of inequality, but also of the general uncertainty and insecurity of this time period. And that's tagged and marked sometimes by these types of images. But Amanda, I would be very curious to hear more about what you made of those images, or if you had something else in mind there, I would like to hear it.
So there's some interesting questions that are sort of shifting the conversation in the direction of gender and sexuality. Leslie T mentioned the film, different from the others, has been restored and re-released. It's excellent, worth seeing, which it is. It's from 1919, presumably still relevant in 1929. She mentions that she saw the film at the Jewish Film Festival in DC, and that was a partnership with us, so we're very happy that you saw it. So she wants to know what happened to Hirschfeld. And was he discredited because of his Judaism and or because of his positions on queer rights? And also, just as a side note, Hirschfeld himself was gay, although he struggled with that a lot.
Yeah, as you predicted, Hirschfeld was, his Institute for Sexual Science was shut down by the Nazis in 1933. And Hirschfeld himself, if I'm not mistaken, went into exile in France, I think, where he died not too long thereafter. And the campaigns more broadly to legalize homosexuality, to repeal paragraph 175, of course, ended in 1933, and it wasn't for many more years, in fact, that the paragraph was abolished. And Hirschfeld himself, the work that he had done in Weimar Berlin was largely really undone by the Nazis, and it wasn't until almost into the 90s that the kind of progressive ideas about LGBTQ rights that he advocated for really became more mainstream in Germany. The post-war period in East and West Germany was characterized by a real conservative politics when it came to gay rights in Germany, and so this point in the 20s was a real sort of flash on the horizon in terms of progressive ideas about gender and sexuality that then went away for a long time. And I do think, though, yes, the film has been restored, and I do think you make an excellent point that's very worth seeing. I mean, I've watched it with students on many occasions, and it's always very surprising to people to see a film from 1919 that is something that they couldn't have imagined would have been made at that point in history. And I do think that Babylon Berlin, interestingly, picks up on this history, and it's a history that has become interesting to a lot of contemporary filmmakers. For instance, Jill Soloway picks up on this history in their show, whose name is escaping me right now.
Is it I Love Dick?
That's
literally the name of the...
It's the other one.
It's not that one. Okay, I don't remember what the other
Sorry,
one was called.
it right now. But there are transparent, thank you. I thought somebody would put it in there. There are scenes in Transparent that trace the family, the Pfefferman family, back to Weimar, Berlin, and that take place actually at the Institute for Sexual Science under Hirschfeld, that take place there. But of course, the Nazis targeted LGBT populations very specifically, and so many people who had been involved in Hirschfeld's Institute were eventually arrested by the Nazis and were deported to concentration camps, both as Jews and as homosexuals. So that point should also be mentioned.
And also, just in case anybody's interested in learning more about Hirschfeld, that time we showed Aus die Anderen with J by J. We also showed a film from Rosa von Braunheim called The Einstein of Sex, which is a very creatively licensed, taken depiction of Magnus Hirschfeld's life. I would take it with like maybe a tablespoon of salt. But it is interesting because you know, Rosa von Braunheim is sort of like one of the eminent queer filmmakers of German cinematic history, and he decided to make this film in the 90s about this person who was so influential in the 20s and in the teens. So if you're interested in watching that, that's also a film that's out there about Hirschfeld's life. And as Jill mentions in her comment, yeah, he went into exile in France in 1930. And now I remember, it was also in that movie. He was going on a world speaking tour, and he had to stay in France, and he watched footage of the Institute being ransacked by the Nazis from a cinema in France, and he died there in 1935. So that's just a little bit on Hirschfeld. And also on the topic of sort of gender sexuality, there was an interesting comment from one of our viewers who said, would you consider the chief of police a covert feminist because he gives Lotte some chances to encourage her ambition to be a detective? And yeah, that was also something I found interesting, was Lotte on this sort of journey to become a detective. Now it may be embedded in the attitudes that they take towards her when she says, I want to work in homicide, but nobody ever outright says so far, there's no way you can do that, you're a woman. Which has been interesting so far to see, including with Volta with the characters who are sort of allowing her to, okay, put your application in and we'll see, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I would call him a covert feminist, but I think there is an openness in the attitudes of some of the characters in the police department about the possibility of Lotte developing a career as a detective. Many of the men notice that she has a particular knack for sleuthing, let's say, and this topic actually becomes a significant plot point that develops in the narrative moving forward, also into season 3. So I think you're picking up on something that's definitely noteworthy in the show at this point, and that you can follow forward.
And we actually have 2 other questions just that seem to be along the same lines, just comments on male characters and their masculinity, or the way they present their masculinity. So Samantha S. has said, I'd be really interested to take up the point of possibly toxic masculinity and Nussen's character. The depiction of his emotionality seems to differ from the more physical processing that other men do in the series. And also on that, I was thinking, he also has another element of himself that suggests that he's not like other guys, because, you know, I mean, I remember at the end of episode 2, he's watching his lover, Svetlana, as Nikos, with mustache and, you know, this wig in men's clothing. And he enjoys her whether she's expressing herself as that or whether she's expressing herself as, you know, out of drag. Like, he seems to, yeah, have another, he seems to be existing on a different plane Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that he is a non-normative character gender-wise, especially within his class context, although you might also think of him as a kind of dandy or something like that, whose very conservative milieu is suppressing the open expression of that perhaps a little bit more. We certainly learn that he is a bit of a black sheep in his family. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler. So I think it's interesting to follow his trajectory, his characterization forward. And certainly the actor who plays Newson, Lars Eidinger, who's kind of an enfant terrible of the German theater scene, and who tends to play kind of non-normative men in general, sort of men whose gender expression is not aligned with hegemonic masculinity, let's say. So the actor himself kind of brings qualities from his other roles that we associate with him a little bit to his characterization of Newson. And again, I mean, I would say there's a certain way in which this is pretty campy. He really camps it up in this role, and kind of over emotes at times, or really demonstrates his kind of enjoyment of the opportunity to play this kind of a character.
Yeah, and that also, just on him being sort of a non-normative masculine character, and also we were just talking about Magnus Hirschfeld and his suggestion that there may be 43 million genders, which I would love to hear what some people just say about that. But not in this room, but in the wider world. But I was thinking of also in cinema, there's very much this sort of, and I guess maybe you could say something to that, but the establishment of what almost seems to be like a gender or a gender expression that didn't exist outside of cinema, whether it's because of the way that cinema, like technically, like you needed to wear certain kinds of makeup for your face to show up on the camera or on the film, or whether it was because it was easier for emoting. It was easier because maybe the movements that the actors had portrayed something that, like, German expressionist film, for instance, wanted to convey. But I'm thinking again of Conrad Veidt's face and how just striking it is. It doesn't really, when I see his face, I don't think of a gender. He's got makeup on, I mean, but not just that. I mean, the way he moves, it's not something that exists in a binaristic sort of definition of gender. But then again, I also think of Freda from Metropolis, who also has very heavy makeup on. He sort of dresses like a little boy, even though he's an adult man. But also he goes around, clinging to people. He's just very, it's other examples, I guess, and just of non-normative gender, and sort of the stars of the time. I think of Vilda Gova and like Gösta Ekman, these kinds of faces that were very androgynous, really, and why that aesthetic sort of came to the fore. When we're just starting to have these conversations verbally about gender, but in film it's already sort of happening, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point of Alice Kuzniar that I cited in the presentation today, where she has this really nice quote, I don't know if I can find it again, but sort of these luminescent queer images that are almost ubiquitous in the classics of Weimar cinema. And I certainly think this is one of the reasons for the enduring fascination of this period of film for contemporary audiences, and across time for audiences. It was certainly a period also in the broader culture of experimentation with gender norms and roles, and of a break with expectations as they had been defined. I mean, certainly not for everyone, and certainly not in any kind of just free-for-all way, but the war, the democratization of society, the changing class roles, the precarity and uncertainty all offered certain kinds of opportunities for experimentation with gender and sexuality, and this new modern discourse of sexuality that was, in large part opened up by Hirschfeld, that sort of dovetailed with different economic times. All of these things, conspired to create a certain kind of openness to transgression of norms and taboos. And I think that the cinema was a focal point for that experimentation. I mean, as we talked about, a lot of the actors were themselves queer in some way or another, and so they were also bringing some of those elements to performance at the time, and there was a real openness in terms of the ability to perform those qualities as well that developed during this period.
Great. And so we're just gonna do a couple more questions. You guys have submitted so many great questions. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to all of them, but we'll do a couple more. So Burkhard H has submitted the question, speaking of aesthetics, I wonder if Babylon Berlin develops any kind of aesthetic of ugliness that is worth discussing. The first thing that came to my mind after seeing the facial prosthetic was Gretchen Henderson's excellent study of ugliness, particularly her brief discussion of those World War I broken faces, who came to represent irreversible political and aesthetic destruction.
That's a great question. I don't know that work, but thank you for calling my attention to it. Gretchen Henderson's study of ugliness. And I know that there's been a fair amount of scholarly research on the topic of prosthetics after World War I and its influence on sort of art and culture. So I'd be interested to look at that study. It's interesting to think about the question of ugliness. I mean, there's certainly a lot of gore in the show and kind of gruesome scenes. We talked a little bit more about this last time, the kind of tension in the show between violence and eroticism that's constantly maintained. And we have lots of examples of that again in these two episodes. I'm thinking, for instance, of the sequence when Rudy and Lotte go and dissect the corpse, and the balloon in which Rudy is trying to capture the gas from the body releases, and Lotte faints, and this whole sort of work in the morgue seems to be a way of piquing the erotic tension between Rudy and Lotte. So it's quite a nasty scene, and there's a lot of scenes with Kardikoff and that are really, really disgusting as well. I don't know if I would call that an aesthetic of ugliness necessarily, and I do feel that the show is very glossy in its depiction, even of the sort of gore for the most part. But I think the question that you raise is an interesting one. Thank you. I would like to think about that a little bit more.
I think also just real quick, I mean, the idea of like the main characters being all pretty conventionally attractive. I mean, Lotte, Rudy, and then you've got, it seems like it's pretty deliberate to me, at least, anybody who's of the working class, anybody who's of the, of this group of people who have been disabled or injured by the war, they have, their disfigurement is a little bit on display, or they are, like for instance, the character of Mutti from a couple of episodes ago. I mean, that was I would say, maybe a little even more disgusting than the part from the autopsy, because you just see her take this rag off God knows where, and she wipes herself down, throws it on the table, and then when he leaves, she starts to wipe the table down with it, and you're just like, what? So, I mean, not just ugliness in terms of people, but ugliness in terms of the stuff you don't want to see, but you know what was happening. Was sort of compelling to me. And when that idea of ugliness was brought up, that's one thing that certainly stood out to me. So one more question about the representation. So we've sort of been going on about the representation of Jewish characters in the Jewish community in this show. And so I'm going to kind of bundle together what Michelle and what Stephen have asked. They both sort of indicate Benda, the character of Benda. So Michelle says, last week you mentioned the dearth of representations of Jewish individuals or communities. I'm wondering what you make of the revelation that the counselor, being Benda, is Jewish in episode 6. And yes, he is the one who plays the organ because he's married to a Catholic person, right? Okay, so she said, it seems you had much more to say about this. So now that we see that such an assimilated and prominent Jew is the series' first representation, would you like to speak to this? And sort of on that, Stephen has said, I think that anti-Semitism must have been more prevalent in German society than is depicted in this show. Benda is the only significant Jewish character, I believe, and being Jewish doesn't seem to negatively affect him very much. Am I missing something?
Yeah, we've spoken about this in a previous incarnation in one of our previous episodes, that I really feel a significant hole in this show is its lack of more and more nuanced representations of Jewish characters who were so important for German society at this time, and especially for the kind of milieus that the show is interested in. Yes, Benda is really our only prominent character who is Jewish. He's an assimilated Jew who has not converted, it's mentioned, but who is married to a Catholic and who enjoys his time playing the organ in the Catholic Church as the official organist, and who invites Rat to attend a Sunday Mass at the church when he's playing the organ. So, you know, it's a very limited depiction, first of all, of Jewish life in Berlin by only showing this one kind of assimilated character. And I'm just trying to see what the questions were. Yes, certainly anti-Semitism was on the rise and quite prevalent in Germany at this time. Benda, as an assimilated Jew and somebody who has a very prominent class and social position, maybe, you know, wouldn't have been as impacted. He works in the police, which was a social democratic stronghold. But certainly we will see as the tensions in the show develop that, well, I don't want to give too many spoilers here, but that, you know, he does come into crosshairs. And that's probably no accident.
So just once more, thanks to everybody who submitted a question. I really appreciate the enthusiasm for the discussion. That's really awesome. And I just wanted to say in closing, since I know this was something that you were getting at earlier, what of the train? Would you like to speak about the train, the symbol of the train, or what it means to you, what you think it means?
Well, I mean, certainly I find it interesting, and I didn't talk about it too much in any of my presentations so far, but it becomes this almost kind of clearinghouse for the political conflicts, the economic conflicts, the ethnic conflicts, you know, of the period. They all sort of converge over this metaphorical train. And as I mentioned earlier, it's certainly no accident that the train holds two cargoes, one of which is poison gas and one of which is gold, right? And when we think about the different groups that are competing to use both the poison and the gold for their different political purposes, I think we can think about the train as something that very deliberately points forward to what happens in Germany in the 30s and 40s. So I don't want to make it into something that is too overdetermined, but but we see in these two episodes, right, that that Nussen is charged with making sure that he gets his hands on that train because the military industrial complex needs that poison gas right now. And at the same time, the train also contains the gold. And there's that interesting sequence where they switch the train cars, and so Kardakov thinks that he's getting into the car that has the gold in it, and instead he's poisoned by the gas. So I mean, these are just very kind of overladen, overdetermined kind of metaphorical sequences in the show, and I just did want to kind of call attention to that because it's not something that I've talked about so much before. And the show plays with this whole idea that there is this legacy of gold that was perhaps stolen from, or not stolen from, but taken back from Tsar Nicholas in the Russian Revolution, and that then subsequently disappeared. So it plays with this kind of whole legend surrounding the Sorokin gold as well. So it's one of those pregnant aspects of the show that we will keep looking towards as we move forward.
Yeah, and the reason why I got really like, ooh, is because I thought maybe you were moving in the direction of my wheelhouse with Walter Benjamin and the Schockerlebnis, you know, the idea that the train being one of those things that's always reminding you that you're in the modern era, you know, Walter Benjamin, for anybody who might be curious, wrote a lot about the shock experience of modernity, especially after the war, World War I, and the idea that whereas when you previously moved through a city, you could sort of be like lost in a reverie, which was something I think like Proust came up with. But the idea that modernity sort of shatters that, and that every time you experience one of these Schockerlebnisse or shock experience, that reverie is shattered, and that's one of the blights. That's one of the reasons why modernity is a blight on our society.
But the train is never moving, and that's also something that's kind of interesting about it. It's parked and then it's stuck, right? We see it moving in the first episode, and then it's landed in a liminal space and is stuck and immobile. So that's also that engine of modernity has stopped moving forward, and I think that's definitely part of that heavily laden, overdetermined emblem that the train is, right?
Yeah. Great. So once again, thank you to Dr. Hester Baer for presenting and for having this conversation with us. And thanks to all of you who tuned in. Thanks to all of you who sent in questions and comments. We really appreciate it. We love the interaction. It's been really great. I promise that by next week I will figure out whatever happened with the chat so that you all can drop whatever you'd like into the chat that time. And just as you may have noticed, we are putting these recordings onto YouTube. Our YouTube account is, and I can put this in like follow up. Actually, I think maybe I got the power to do youtube.com/user/GIWAS1. And if you all got that, that is our YouTube channel. And that is where, did you get it, Hester?
Yep.
Okay. I hope everybody got it. But yeah, that's where our video will go. And so if you'd like to rewatch or anything like that again, that's where it will go. And yeah, thanks so much again for tuning in and for being interested in this series. We've gotten so many wonderful comments about like people who have watched it and then they watch it again so that they can prepare for this. And then after hearing the conversations, they watched again, which I totally get, because like, why watch another show when you could just watch the same show 5 times, right? Definitely not interested in Sexy Sigmund Freud or whatever they're trying to sell me on Netflix right now. No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally going to watch that at some point. But yeah, so thanks so much again. We really appreciate it. We hope that you all tune in on the 28th, next Thursday, so that you can participate in our final discussion on season 1 for episodes 7 and 8. Hester, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Thanks everyone for all super great comments and for popping in and leaving your thoughts and the great questions. I appreciate it very much. It was great. Once again, it's a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and have a good long weekend. A good long socially distant weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.